But let's segue back to issues related to the ANC, because today marks 9 years since the passing of Nelson Mandela, South Africa's first democratically elected president. His political party, the ANC, has been criticized for allowing corruption and basically the decay and collapse of public services in some areas. Factions in the former liberation movement have also got worse. Let's talk about the situation in the ANC now with Asanda Ngoasheng, a political analyst. Asanda, very good afternoon to you. Thank you for your time and your patience. There is an irony, is there not, that we're talking today about the anniversary of the passing of the ANC's most popular president on a day when it's deciding to do what to do with its current leader.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Temegile. I think it's always very interesting to kind of take a step back and look back at the ANC and see how such an amazing and really well thought out organization initially has disintegrated into this disaster that we see today. We know that the ANC to this day has some of the best policies when it comes to what needs to be done to end inequality, when it comes to what needs to be done to redistribute the economy of South Africa. But we also know that the ANC has constantly and consistently failed to implement these policies. And these are the things that make people so disappointed and so sad in the ANC, because it started out so well with Nelson Mandela telling us about the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, which set out to give people who previously didn't have housing. It set out to electrify communities that before had never had access to electricity, and it set out to change the face of the economy of this country and the ways in which we do business, and set out to include South Africans of all races and hues in business, in all other, aspects of society. But what we are seeing now is a huge reversal of all of those gains made in the early days. Of course, we know immediately after Nelson Mandela left, you had Thabo Mbeki, who also did, I think, quite a good job in trying to stabilize the economy and in bringing the country to a surplus, which was very swiftly eaten through by Jacob Zuma and his cabinet in his era. And we've just disintegrated from that Zuma era to now the Cyril Ramaphosa era, which was even compounded further by the fact that we had 2 years of COVID, which people are still reeling from. And so you've got a Cyril Ramaphosa who's just survived a pandemic. You've got an economy that has just survived the implications of the pandemic and are still currently in the midst of a global economic crisis that has seen even South Africa have, five going on 6 interest rate hikes, which has led to people, literally being unable to afford their lives. People who at the beginning of the year were doing quite well.
Mm-hmm. Can it be argued, though, Asanda, successfully, that in fact, while the early years of South Africa's democratic dispensation under the leadership of people such as the late Nelson Mandela, while many look fondly at those years, some have also said that many of what's gone wrong in the subsequent decade and a half, in fact, the foundations of those horrors, be it the lack of justice for apartheid victims, be it the lack of sufficient progress in leveling out the economic playing field, especially for black people and women in this country. Some say the foundations were laid back then, but we were also caught up in the euphoria of the moment that perhaps we didn't scrutinize things as we should. Do you agree?
I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I think there is some truth to it, but not to the extent that people put it at. So to my mind, it's more a case of we had an economy that needed to be stabilized. And so there's good work that Thabo Mbeki and the people that were in his cabinet did. We can't deny that. There's also good work that was done in terms of trying to get South Africans who have never had access to a house before, who have never had access to even a salary before, to be able to get there. I believe that what we literally had was a situation where we were running full steam ahead and we're doing quite well, in my opinion. and then things turned. So I believe that the turning point was when Jacob Zuma was appointed as the president of South Africa. That was a huge turning point, because you can see, if you look at the numbers, any of the South African numbers, whether you're talking poverty levels and the extent to which poverty was being eradicated, those numbers start to kind of go back as soon as you have Jacob Zuma in power. If you look at the levels of corruption, and so all governments globally across the world have a low level of corruption. This is a known case. So South Africa is not unique in that. But how high the corruption is then determines the state's ability to do what it needs to do. And we saw low-level corruption during Nelson Mandela's era, yes. During Thabo Mbeki's era, yes. But this corruption then escalated to an untenable level during Jacob Zuma. And one of the best things about that we have that enables us to be able to make some of these bold statements that we're making is precisely because we've got the State Capture Commission, which basically allowed us to have a granular view, a micro view of what was happening in South Africa during the era of President Jacob Zuma, which is when this country was decimated. So yes, by the point we got to where there was factionalism between Jacob Zuma and President Jacob Zuma and President Thabo Mbeki's camp, there was factionalism in the ANC that they should have dealt with much earlier. There was a lack of succession planning which should have been dealt with much earlier. And in fact, even when it comes, for example, to issues like transformation, like black economic empowerment, there was a lot that had been done. You had BE charters and you had all of these laws which had actually been monitored and regulated during that era, which during the Jacob Zuma era started not being monitored, not being regulated, and not being taken care of. In fact, even the issue of HIV, we know Jacob Zuma was the one who was at the helm of the moral regeneration project, and he did the unthinkable, and he claimed to have sex and or raped a woman who had HIV and claimed that he was able to do that without a condom because he just showered. And so that shot through the entire moral regeneration project, shot through all the messaging that had been sent about HIV and our efforts to stemming the tide of HIV, which of course happened on top of Thabo Mbeki's own failings on dealing with HIV. And so there is a combination and a concoction of various actions that have been taken by successive ANC presidents, which has led us here. But there is a marked decline when it comes to the point at which Jacob Zuma takes the reins. Because remember also that the country that we inherited from apartheid was really in quite a dismal state economically, psychosocially, and in many other ways. And so it was always going to be a difficult uphill climb to be able to get to the state that we were, at least in the early 2000s, right up until almost, the beginning of the global crisis in 2008, which then coincided with the Big Bang within the ANC when Thabo Mbeki was removed, which didn't help us at all because we were coming out of a global crisis and we were shifting presidents and shifting policies and shifting thinking and allegiances at a time when we could ill afford it. If you look at even in terms of international relations, the directions that we were going at that era were completely at odds with the direction that had been going before. We were having more global, more international conversations. We were an international player. And in the Zuma era, there was a big focus on Africa, which is important. But Africa, unfortunately, is not and does not it's not part of the big trade partners that we have. And so all of those things have had implications. And even what people sometimes refer to as the good that Jacob Zuma in terms of rural development, it falls flat in the face of, it's all good and well to have rural development, but it has to be sustained and it has to be kind of balanced with urban development. So there's no use in pumping millions of rands to rural areas, which when you know that young people are running to the urban areas and there isn't a balance in terms of how things are being financed and how things are being looked at.
But I suppose on that it could also be argued that if we developed rural areas more sufficiently, that would then prevent people from having to come to the urban centres to seek work if those opportunities were available in their immediate communities or closer to home. But I want to move on then and talk to the issue of Nelson Mandela and the legacy issue, because next year will be the 10th year since his passing. What do you think will be left of his beloved ANC come that time, when you consider where it stands today? And is the memory and legacy of Nelson Mandela fading even from the minds of the public? I mean, when you look at it today, it's not even a mainstream conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think sadly, Nelson Mandela's name and the ANC were always going to be intertwined, because he was the star of that political party. And although his brand grew to a certain extent to be bigger than the ANC, because it's always tied and linked, it has led to a decline in the Mandela brand and how people think of Nelson Mandela, because you can't think of Nelson Mandela with as much fondness as before, because his political party has made our lives a literal living hell at this point in time. And so people are not going to be thinking about him or any president really as fondly as we used to say 5 or even 10 years ago. And so I think by the time we get to the 10th year anniversary of Nelson Mandela's passing, we're going to be seeing an ANC that at its weakest. We're seeing that already. At its most divided, at its least sense making. You know, when you listen to what the ANC has to say, when you listen to kind of the arguments that are being made, like even now, they're arguing about whether we should be led by someone who's more corrupt or less corrupt. They're arguing about whether, the previous president was able to get away with more corruption or less corruption. And it's no longer about whether, is this the best person for the job? Is this the best person that South Africa can produce? Do they have what it takes to take South Africa from where it is right now to the future, the kind of future that we need to have? Right. And, a lot of countries right now are restructuring, are re-engineering and rethinking their economies, because they are in a post-COVID world where they have the opportunity to shift and change many things quite drastically and in ways that were not possible before. And we are so busy embroiled in the ANC and its shenanigans that we don't even have an opportunity to have a conversation about the economy of South Africa and how we're going to shift it forward in a post-COVID world, and what kind of future we are talking about when, our politicians are so busy fighting off allegations and not caring or thinking about the actual state of the country. If you look at that NEC, it's like a wanted list, right? It's a series of people with allegations against them. And I keep thinking, what kind of political party is so bad that they really struggle to find somebody who has no accusations or allegations against them? In a South Africa that actually has people, most South Africans are law-abiding citizens. And so most South Africans don't have corruption allegations and they don't have these kind of issues. So why are we continuously being forced to choose from the tainted bunch that we know?
Asanda
there's
Ngoasheng.
even a meme going around,
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure it's a conversation that we'll all be able to continue at length, especially when you look at the ANC of today and the future, especially in those days when the conference will be sitting 4 days worth of conversation, and we'll bring you all that coverage, and hopefully, Asanda, you'll be able to join us for some of those discussions. For now, thank you very much for being on Daytime Update.